Now I'd like to welcome to the show Sarah Coleman. She is an assistant professor at at Texas State University, author of The Walls Within, The Politics of Immigration in Modern America. Sarah, welcome to the program.
Sam, thanks so much for having me.
And Emma is here with me as well. We just played a clip of activists who were headed to the New York State Capitol to talk to lawmakers about getting COVID relief for folks who are undocumented or unauthorized who have been working in New York State, providing tax dollars. And it really, one of the things that I found fascinating about your book was I am used to, because as an adult for most of my life, the idea of unauthorized, undocumented immigrants getting any type of services from the U.S. government has been a very contentious, controversial issue. But that was not always the case. Give us a little bit of a history of unauthorized immigrants in this country, going back to the early part, I guess, really late 1800s.
So I think most listeners would be surprised by this fact, which is between 1935 and 1971, no federal laws barred non-citizens, right? Even unauthorized immigrants from Social Security benefits, things like unemployment insurance or ADC, which later becomes aids to family with dependent children, right? And as new programs are created in the 60s, like Medicaid or the food stamp program, the same rules are applied, right? So basically until the 1970s, under federal law, both authorized and unauthorized immigrants are eligible for these programs on the same basis as citizens. Right. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is sort of that access to these programs has been chipped away and sort of removed piecemeal by piecemeal. First in the 1970s, right, we start to see an attack on unauthorized immigrants' access to these programs. And it's sort of this rise of a new wave of anti-immigrant sentiment in the 1970s really focuses on unauthorized immigrants' access to what we would think of as sort of the social safety net that, the COVID relief bill is part of that. I
want to catch up with that because you have basically four areas where their rights have been chipped away. But before we get that, let's go back to just give us a brief history so that we have a context for this.
Yeah.
In terms of the different moments in our history where there has been a shift or at least a specific disposition towards immigrants in this country, and particularly unauthorized ones.
Okay. So you see a couple big moments, one beginning in the 1880s that targets initially Asian immigration on the West Coast. That's the first sort of big moment of federal intervention. Before that moment, there's going to be a lot of local and sort of state, sort of more community-based movements against immigrants. But the big federal push first comes against Asian immigration on the West Coast in the 1880s. The next sort of big moment.
Sorry, what was behind that though? Why did the federal government decide in the 1880s that we're going to get involved in this?
So you start to see California you have, the rise of the gold rush, you have the railroad development in the West, you see a huge sort of influx of Chinese immigration on the West Coast that is going to lead California to try and make steps to regulate immigration. And the federal government steps in and says, you know what, you're making a decision that has foreign policy implications. So we don't want you, the state of California, sort of driving policy. And so the federal government sort of steps in at this moment, and it starts to legislate in a new way.
And what drove that, though? Was that the fact that these Asian immigrants were working on the railroads and essentially there was anxiety about job loss? Was that kind of what pushed it forward?
There's anxiety about job loss. There's racism at the heart of it. Obviously, there's a huge sort of concern at this moment, sort of this nativist sentiment that, that Asian immigrants were sort of going to sort of in some way take over the United States. Sort of the same rhetoric that we hear nowadays, sort of about sort of the undocumented population is sort of what you would have heard in the 1880s in California, sort of much of the same rhetoric, right? They're going to take over our country. It's a wave. They're a threat to the Anglo-Saxon race at the time. Sort of that kind of language is what you would have heard at the time.
Was there any pushback from the sort of the corporate or capitalist class insofar as like we frankly we need this labor and it's cheaper or something to that effect?
Right. And throughout, sort of, you're going to have this tension that's present throughout history, right? Between those who need, like agribusiness, right, is going to be present, or at the time, the railroads or various other sort of groups are going to be present. So in the 1880s, you're going to have that presence. In the 1920s and 24, which is sort of once you move past this question of Asian immigration in the 1880s and you move to the 20s, and this huge rise in anti-immigrant sentiment comes again, you know, there's going to be huge exemptions from the 1920s laws, which we can talk about, but the 1920s laws are going to have huge exemptions for the Western Hemisphere. Why is that? It's because agribusiness wants continued access to Mexican labor, right? So the next moment we see of huge anti-immigrant sentiment is in the 20s. We're going to see, again, this anti-immigrant sentiment in the 70s, right? The people who are going to push for restriction are going to push for something called employer sanctions, which is a category of restrictions that penalize people for hiring undocumented workers, right? Who's going to push back against that? It's, again, going to be sort of corporate agribusiness. You're going to see that again, sort of a key part of Reagan's base, actually.
All right, so let's go. So let's take that in the 1920s. Like, what gave rise to it in the 20s, as opposed to, I don't know, the early aughts of the 20th century?
So what happens in the 1920s is you have this, you've seen a huge shift in the immigration pattern. From generally before that, it was Northern and Western European, right? And you start to see the rise of Southern and Eastern European immigrants, right? We see Jews, we see Italians, we see Slavic people, right? So people from sort of that part of the world. And that sort of shift in immigration pattern happens. At the same time, you have sort of the anti-immigrant sentiment of World War I sort of comes together. Plus, you have the rise at the same time of this pseudoscientific racism known as eugenics. And so this sort of swirling comes together at this moment, sort of in the late sort of 1917, 1918, 1920, and it sort of comes together. And that's when you start to see new federal restrictions again. Sort of, it's not as much a question, and Asians will be impacted by the 1924 Act, but it's sort of more based on this concern with rising immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe.
How much of the so-called Spanish flu influenced that? I mean, I guess I'm a little more sensitive to that question because of frankly what we've seen happen with Asian American, broadly speaking, Asian racism in the context of this pandemic.
Right. So I think there's not as much that you would think about as the Spanish flu per se, but right, there's this idea that immigrants are quote unquote unclean, right? And sort of that sort of idea that because of eugenics, certain populations are predisposed to disease, or that they're going to be the ones bringing it, right? So that's sort of more of the general theory role that, like, health, right? This is a moment where Americans are obsessed with science and health, things like vitamins and all this sort of moment, and it's feeding into this anti-immigrant sentiment, sort of in a more the idea that, like, people are bringing diseases across the border. You see this particularly in the Southwest. You're going to see sort of a lot of the Southwest border will have like cleansing stations at the border point where people will sort of have to go through these horrific treatments because they're bringing to make sure they're not bringing diseases into the United States.